If you would do me a favor and first say and spell your first and last name for me, and let me know what your title is.
Okay. Patricia Lindemood, Patricia. Lindemood is all one word, Lindamood. Many times people think Linda is part of my first name and Mood is the last name, but it's all together, Lindemood.
Okay.
And I'm a co-director of a private practice dealing with learning problems that is called Lindemood Bell Learning Processes.
Okay. I'm going to just jump right into this. Advocates for children with learning disorders say California's new high school exit exam discriminates against children with learning disorders. Can you kind of tell me how you feel about that? What are your thoughts on that?
I would have a question first for people who are saying that, which is, what is the purpose of the test? What do they want to know from the test? Because if they simply want to know, does the student have content knowledge about subjects within the test, then if a person can't read and they really want to know, but does he have knowledge about different areas of content, then it would be reasonable to read the test to the person. However, if the purpose of the test is to determine whether students can access knowledge, access information from printed material, as well as in the other ways that we can access it, then I think we need them to be able to read the test themselves in order to know, under normal circumstances, like in a job where they have to read something, would they be able to read it and understand what they're supposed to do, for example.
Then in your opinion, what should a high school exit exam be testing?
Well, first of all, the decision has to be made, what do we want to know from the exam? Because until that decision is made, I don't think that there can be a test given in such a way that the knowledge can be checked.
Okay, I guess I'm kind of asking wrong. In your opinion, what would we want to gather from the exit exam? Which of the two options would you think would be what we need to get from high school exit exam?
If we want to know, after 12 years in school, are we turning out students who can become producing members of society and take their place in the workforce and so forth, then I would think that we would want students to be able to read the test themselves as well as answer questions about it. So in that case, my position would be that making accommodations, such as reading the test to students, still doesn't tell us then what we need to know about how we are preparing students to take their place in the world.
Okay, now I know it's going to sound like a silly question, but why? Why doesn't that tell us?
Because it's just not possible to fill in the normal requirements of life completely without being able to read and comprehend what you read.
All these questions are going to be pretty closely related. The suit also accuses California of failing to provide alternative means of measuring disabled students' skills. Should we all be on the same page, be held to the same standards?
That ties back into what I was saying earlier about what you want to know from the test. And so I think there needs to be some consensus first among parents and among educators as to what the goals of education are. Because right now, if, for example, in university training programs, if we are making accommodations for people who have been identified as having a learning disability, And if they are in a teacher training program and accommodations have to be made for them for tests there, such as are being asked now for students coming out of high school, then if those people are graduated as teachers and sent out to teach and they themselves cannot read material appropriately, that would be like asking someone who's colorblind to teach art. And we wouldn't think of doing that. So I think we have to ask and answer some questions before there can be lawsuits about things that are happening.
Do you think it's fair and reasonable to expect high school kids graduating to read and write and spell? Is that a fair expectation, including dyslexics and people with so-called learning disabilities?
If the question is, do we want students, when they graduate from high school, to be able to read? There has been enough now research to identify one of the major causes of a reading disability, and yet teacher training institutions are not equipped to turn teachers out to handle that area of need adequately yet. And so perhaps it's premature to be asking for students to be tested until teachers are given a chance to have the training and the skills they need to meet the needs of these students.
So you're saying it is possible for the students with these disabilities to be able to read and should be able to pass this test, no problem, just like any other kid?
Yes, there will there will still be levels of difference among people, because there are differences in how we can put it all together and so forth. But in my personal experience, I do not believe that we need to be turning out children who cannot read.
Whose fault is that?
I think I don't think we should be thinking about it in terms of whose fault is it, but I think we should be thinking about what do we know from research now that needs to be addressed if we are going to engage a brain and enable it to acquire certain skills. And that if we then can say, where is that process breaking down? Where should we be putting our effort? I think it needs to be put first at the level of teacher training, not first at why aren't students learning how to read, as if the problem is theirs.
Kind of give me what you think the bottom line is here. Does the lawsuit have merit? You know, who's at fault?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sum everything up and just give me what you think is the bottom line.
The lawsuit may have merit in terms of helping to again bring this question to a head of where should we be putting our effort. But I think that if we can approach it without the idea of blame, that then we'll have more chance for something to be accomplished. Instead, as I say, by using the present knowledge from research that says what are the factors, what does a brain have to be able to do in order to learn how to read, and how can we make it possible for that to happen. And that goes back to giving teachers adequate training, because the gap between what's known about how the brain has to function in order to read, what kind of information processing has to be able to be integrated between hearing and seeing in order to handle that match-up between spoken and written language, then if we're not addressing the needs for teachers to have a chance to benefit from the knowledge that research has given us, and if instead we are blaming children or penalizing children who have not learned how to read when teachers haven't been yet given the tools to assist that to happen, then can you see that we're approaching the problem from the wrong end?
We're all still going okay. I had a little beep in my ear.
Mhm.
Let me ask you how you know John.
I know John because I learned from a newspaper article about John that he had been unable to read for most of his life into adulthood, and that through the library tutoring program in his area, that as an adult he had been given some help that began to open up the reading process for him when it had not opened up before. But I knew from the number of hours that had been spent in trying to open up that process that there was a type of information processing that his brain needed that was still not sufficiently accessible to him. And that was the ability to judge within a spoken word how many sounds are there, what are they, and what order do they occur in. And so I thought it would be very interesting to have a chance to meet John and to test, to find out with the phonics instruction that he had had, did he now have access to this basic, what's called phoneme awareness that he needed in order to match up the spoken and written word. And it worked out for me to meet John and to measure that phoneme awareness, and he did not have it. He was still having to guess at words primarily from some vague awareness that there was something about letters and sounds, but he didn't have enough of that awareness to become independent and self-correcting in all of his reading. And so I could say to him, there is a way to bring in this other information processing that your brain needs if you want to go after it, and he did.
Great. Anything you'd like to add that I didn't ask you about?
Yes, and I don't know whether this will fit any place or where you might put it, but out of the research that has been sponsored by National Institutes of Health for the last 10 years, there is a type of processing that the brain has to do, which is being called phoneme awareness. And it's the ability to judge how many sounds there are in a word, what they are, and their order. My concern, because I was one of the early pioneers in researching this factor and how it related to reading and spelling, is that the term phoneme awareness has now become a buzzword, and the term is being required to be put into educational goals without sufficient understanding of actually what that means and how you develop that ability for a brain, instead of just ask it to try to make this awareness come on its own by some kind of activities that ask you to practice it, but do not give you any way to develop it if you don't have enough so that you can engage in those activities.
Okay, sounds great. Get you to say and spell your first and last name for me.
John Corcoran, John-Corcoran.
What are your thoughts on this lawsuit?
Well, I think it's always nice to put the spotlight on a problem, but this is not the problem. This is a symptom to the problem. And the problem is that we fail to teach people how to read, write, and spell. They've been in school for 12 years, and I think it's reasonable to expect that they should know how to read and write and spell. And even if they're dyslexic or learning disabled, we have the research now that tells us that people can learn how to read, write, and spell. I'm an example of that research. I'm a dyslexic myself, would be labeled dyslexic. If I went to school today, I would be labeled learning disabled. And at the age of 48, I have learned to read. And it's been a long process for me, but the good news is that we can learn how to read, write, and spell with proper instruction. So this lawsuit, to me, is focused at the wrong end of the spectrum. And we're talking about the wrong things. I think we need to be talking about the first grade, the second grade, the third grade, all the way through school, imparting basic skills. Because for me, accommodation, this world is not going to accommodate kids that can't read, write, or spell. The workplace is not going to accommodate people that can't read, write, or spell. So I'm an advocate for imparting the skills and the values of literacy and to stay with it. So that's my position on it. I'm always interested in the spotlight being on the very fact that America we've committed to teaching everybody how to read, write, and spell. And this is really just a distraction. This is a sidebar issue and discussion that's going on. And in some ways, a lot of wasted emotion, in my opinion. And I don't mean to be derogatory towards anybody that, wants to help their child, but I think it's about frustration more than anything else when parents, reach out and sue for this. And it's not, to me, if there's anybody we should be looking at, is the universities that have failed to teach teachers how to teach children how to read, write, and spell, because the key to teaching people like me to read, write, and spell is proper instruction, and that comes from properly trained teachers.
Okay, good answer. Covered just about everything.
One question.
Let me ask you I'm just going to ask you a few questions,
Yeah.
Personal questions about growing up. Where did you grow up?
Well, I actually graduated from high school in California. I'm a graduate of high school in California, and I've traveled during the Second World War. My father was with the USO, so during the war and after the war, we traveled quite a bit, and to the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And I graduated from the University of Texas at El Paso, and I couldn't write a sentence, I couldn't write a paragraph, and I was reading maybe the second, third grade level, and like Pat said, guessing at those words that I knew.
A lot of people would say, this guy made it so far not knowing how to read. How did you do it?
Well, that's a long story, but a part of your question is says this guy made it a long ways. One of the things, I never beat the system. I never really maximized my potential. I was always frustrated by the written word. This is a culture that's dominated by the written word. It's pretty hard to escape it. As far as my education, the first 12 years of my education, I was socially promoted. So I'm a survivor of social promotion, and all you have to do when I was in high school is behave yourself, and you got a diploma. And it's true today, as it was when I was in high school. And then when I went to college, I resorted to cheating at a lot of different levels, and that's how I got through. And I learned, I had an inquiry mind. I learned by listening and doing and seeing, but I want to say that I never beat the system. The system beat me every single day of my life, and the system, the dominant literate culture, beats people that can't read, write, and spell, and we really are second-class citizens. So while a part of me celebrates that I made it, another part of me really is saddened by the fact that I had to wait until I was 48 years old to enjoy the gift of literacy and to be able to compete and feel like I was a first-class citizen, and certainly academically, in the academic world. And I think that people that do read, they've underestimated their precious gift of literacy. They take it for granted, and they don't really realize the pain and frustration that we experience. And also, as a person with dyslexia, I'm empathetic, and I think sometimes the parents of little boys and little girls like me, it's harder on them than it is on us. And I think the parents that are suing the school district, regarding this test, I think It's out of a lot of frustration, and a lot of times we believe we now have the research to shatter the myth of illiteracy, and that is that people with learning disabilities can learn how to read, write, and spell with proper instruction. And we, for a long time, have just discounted and said, you know, you'll never know how to read or write or spell because you're dyslexic and you won't be able to do that. Well, I defy that kind of thinking.
Okay. A lot of time and money goes into a lawsuit. Where would this time and money be better spent?
Well, unfortunately, this debate continues to go on. We all want people to learn how to read and write and spell. The school district here has made a commitment. The nation has made a commitment to universal literacy. You know, there's a difference between what we're saying and what we're doing. The gap between the research and the knowledge that we have and it being in the hands of the practitioner, that is the classroom teacher, is a huge gap. So that's where the energy should be focused in teaching teachers how to teach people how to read, write, and spell. And the other thing is we're always looking, I think sometimes we use the word blame, but I don't mean to be blaming. I'm trying to be analytical, and the universities have failed. And they need to be their feet needs to be put to the fire. They have failed to teach teachers how to teach children how to read, write, and spell. And that's where I think, that's really where we ought to have the focus right now. That's the issue there, is we're putting out teachers that go into the classroom and they aren't prepared. Through no fault of their own, they're not prepared to deal with little boys and little girls like me. And some people learn to read like birds learn to fly, and they just walk by the library and get it. We know that. They don't really need much instruction. It's at the opposite end of the spectrum, the dyslexic, the learning disabled, the John Corcorans, at the opposite end that need this intensive treatment. And the good news is that we can learn how to read, write, and spell. That's the good news. And I guess that's why I'm concerned about a lawsuit that accommodates. And what really accommodates me in terms of my own self-determination and my own ability to be a learner is give me the skills. Give me the skills. Impart those skills, and I will have the power to be, you know, self-determined. I will be able to read and learn. But first you have to teach me how to read before I can read to learn. And even though we have a very visual world and we have a lot of television, the printed word still really makes a lot of difference between how much money you're going to bring home from the workplace. And so it's really just the need for literacy skills has increased, not decreased. So I think we're doing a disservice when we think we're going to accommodate. We don't live in a country that appreciates accommodation or affirmative action. We've already gone through that. In a sense, accommodation for learning disability is another form of affirmative action, and we're kind of sensitive to that in America. We like a fair playing field for all, for everybody. And I think that this creates a problem when we ask special considerations for one group of people than another group. So.
Because when you get into the real world, it's not like that.
When you get into the real world, the only place where you're going to get accommodation is if you're working for your father or your grandfather. The real world requires of everybody, you know, these skills. When I hire somebody, I expect them to have the skills. I'm not going to excuse them. I'm not going to do that. So we're doing a really disservice if we think we're going to have accommodation in this country across the board and that we're going to accommodate people that can't read, write, or spell. We can't accommodate them. No one's going to get on the, nobody can, if you can't read, write, or spell, you don't get to get on the information highway. You know, and we're talking about technology and we're talking about information, the information age and the computer. That's about the printed page. And I think people underestimate, you know, what language is and the written language. And I guess for me, I spent 40 years of my life thinking that I couldn't learn how to read, write, and spell. And I did the best I could without that. But I was tricked. I was tricked thinking that something was wrong with me. I was misled and fooled. And the fact is, when I went to the Carlsbad Library, I met a lady who helped me break the code. And then I met Pat Lindemuth, and I went from the 6th grade to the 12th grade in a very, very short period of time. And so I know firsthand that I know what the difficulties are. I know how hard it is for some of us to acquire language. You know, I have a little granddaughter who walked by the library and she was reading when she was 4 years old. I was just barely talking when I was 3 years old. I had some delays in my language processing. And we're more normal than abnormal. And this labeling has made us feel abnormal, and the culture has treated us as abnormal, and they've lowered expectations. And I think that this exit exam is another example, lowering expectations instead of dealing with the real problem, and that is imparting skills in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And unfortunately today, as it was when I was in school, if you don't learn how to read by the time you're out of the 4th grade, chances are you're not going to learn how to read, write, and spell. So there lies the problem, that we have given up on these children, little boys and little girls like me. We've given up on them in the 4th grade, and we haven't done anything to really demand, expect them to learn how to read, write, and spell. And part of that is because we haven't prepared our teachers for it. And if you ask teachers in private, if they're prepared to teach boys and girls like me how to read, write, and spell, like 5% of them will say yes. We're talking about 95% of the general teaching population that will acknowledge that they aren't prepared to teach little boys and little girls like me how to read, write, and spell. We have to change that attitude, and we have to change that behavior.
So, in the meantime, with the test, is there a meantime? You know, while we're trying to teach our teachers how to teach students with learning disabilities, in the meantime, is the test unfair? Is there a meantime? Should teachers be held accountable now?
What do we do now? The question is, you know, if I have a child in the 2nd grade, or the 3rd grade, or the 4th grade, I don't have any more time. I don't have time. Every moment counts. I can't wait. I have to be an advocate for my child. I have to find these skills somewhere. And I think that we have been asked, the general public, and I think we have to be patient. I think the problem, America has found out that the problem is deeper and wider than we thought it was in terms of reading and writing. But I think we have to come out of our denial, and we have to be honest, and we quit blowing smoke screens. And in a sense, this test is about a smoke screen. It's not the problem. The problem is imparting the skills. It's not at that end. How long does it take to teach a child to read, write, and spell? Is 12 years long enough? That's how long they're in school, 12 or 13 years. At the end of that process, don't you think we should have figured it out somewhere along that line? And I think that's what the general public is saying to teachers, without trying to aggravate them. I don't want teachers mad at me. I understand their plight, and I understand that they have a problem because they don't know how to do something, but I really expect them to get on board and do something about those deficiencies. Just like to be a good teacher, you have to be a good student, and they need to be good students, and that's a part of it.
So there's no time to waste. The time is.
There is no time, and it's a good example is the results of the last 10 years just came out in a report. Teachers got a report card. how have we done in the last 10 years in terms of improving fourth grade test scores? And we've been working at this for 10 years now, and the results are flat. As a matter of fact, 66 and 2/3 of the fourth graders are reading below grade level, and a tremendous number of minorities can't read, write, and spell. It seems to me like the minority community should get up in arms and say, there's too many minority kids that aren't learning how to read, write, and spell. And the gap is the gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing, and you can measure literacy as one of the critical factors in measuring that economic and social gap. And that's a skill that equalizes things, and it's probably the most important human rights issue facing this nation right now. It's one of the most important civil rights issues right now in imparting these skills so our citizens and our kids, you can't compete, you can't succeed in the classroom in the 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade if you don't have basic reading and writing skills, and you're not going to succeed in the workplace. So for me, going back to the test and what this test is about, the test is about, to me, the best thing is for me to have an opportunity to say, that's not the problem. The problem is something else, and the problem is that we're not delivering, and we don't have a lot of time. And certainly for individuals, we don't have time, they don't have time. And if you're a parent out there, you don't have any time for your child. You can't, if your child's 16 years old and they can't read, write, or spell, he's in trouble. And it's not because his brain's not capable, it's because the system pushes them through the system and out the system after they give them a piece of paper saying you graduated, after we accommodate them on their test and we give them whatever test score they want, give them all A's. And they all get A's, and they go out to the workplace and they give their piece of paper to their employer and say, hey, I got an A on my exit exam. What good is that going to do me? I want you to go over there and read that paper over there. I want you to get on that computer, So what good is that going to do? I have a little bit of emotion about it.
I think we covered everything.
Okay.
However, I just want to ask you, kind of in as close to a sentence as you can.
Okay, that's my biggest problem.
What is the world like when you don't know how to read?
It's like, in a sense, it's like going 15 rounds against Ali with one arm tied behind your back, It's like having one eye when you could have two. It is for me, I can tell you the joy, the emotional and psychological joy of overcoming my own illiteracy, and that is the emotion of it. But I was illiterate for about 45 years of my life, and I've been developing literate for about 10 years, 12 years of my life, and there's a big difference in the way I perceive things. I'm more civilized, I'm less defensive, I actually think different, I process things different, I hear things different. So there's again, it's really hard to articulate that difference, but it is a major difference being literate. And I think that literate people underestimate this because they've been reading and writing since they were children. They don't know. It's almost like being potty trained or walking. You forget how you got it. But almost every day of my life since I've learned to read, I have a consciousness about, what gift and what power that I have and what independence. One of the things I hated the most about not knowing how to read was being dependent on other people. I was always, every time a piece of paper was in front of me, I always had to find somebody to read it to me, explain what was on it, and most of the time I was tricking them because I didn't want them to know that I couldn't read or write or spell. Because in America, illiteracy is a form of child neglect and child abuse, and it really truly has a shame based with it. So where am I right now? The difference, one of the emotional and psychological pieces, I don't feel that shame in that embarrassment and that fear that I lived with all of my life. And it's come to the surface, and I've worked it through. And it not only is it a cognitive development, but it's also a spiritual experience. And I believe that what's true of me as an individual is true of a nation. When it invites its second-class citizens to be first-class citizens, they're going to be better citizens, and they're going to be participants, and they're going to be changed, and their lives are changed. I've talked to thousands of adults that have learned to read, and they'll tell you pretty much the same thing that I'm saying, that God, this is wonderful. And I think that we're doing a terrible disservice when we think that we can pass people through our system and hold them in these tanks, in our systems for 12 years, and not expect them to know how to read and write and spell at the end of 12 years. We can do that. We know how to do that. Pat Lindemoon knows how to do that. We know how to do that. We can do it. And it's the will that we lack right now. We lack the will. And we lack the will because we have all these sidebar discussions going on that distract the focus of what we want to really focus on. And we want results. And this test argument lawsuit is not going to teach one single person how to read or write or spell. No one's going to learn how to read or write or spell, no matter what the results of that test is, no matter what the results of that lawsuit is. And so I want to focus on reading, writing, and spelling. I want to focus on teaching teachers how to teach people like me how to read, write, and spell.
Okay. Sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your
All
time.
right, thanks. Okay, Pat, we got to go do your business.